The studio lights burned bright, casting a harsh, almost clinical glow over the sleek, modern set of prime debate. The network's signature blue and white branding wrapped the room in an aura of authority, a visual reminder of the show's reputation for hard-hitting, no-holds-barred journalism. The set was meticulously designed to convey power and professionalism, with sharp angles, polished surfaces, and a backdrop that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. Off-camera, producers hovered like shadows, their eyes darting between monitors, fingers poised over switches, ready to cut or amplify at a moment's notice. This was the kind of segment the show thrived on: high stakes, high tension, and a guest who could be cornered, unraveled, made to slip. And tonight, the guest was Karoline Leavitt, a rising conservative force known for her sharp intellect and unshakable composure. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of electric energy that only live television could produce. Karoline took her seat, with a calm that belied the storm she knew was coming. She had been here before, not on this stage, but in rooms like it, facing men like Paul Danning, men who thought they could break her, with a well-placed question, a raised eyebrow, a tone of voice that dripped with condescension. She had seen it all, and she had prepared for it all. Her posture was relaxed, but deliberate, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her expression one of quiet confidence. Across from her, Paul adjusted his posture, leaning forward just enough to assert dominance without appearing aggressive. The cameras framed him perfectly, his face a mask of practiced concern, his voice smooth and measured. He was a veteran journalist, a man who had made a career out of cornering his guests, stripping them of their composure, and controlling every conversation. His interviews were traps, his questions, weapons. And tonight, he thought he had the upper hand. He had done his research, studied her past appearances, and prepared a line of questioning designed to expose what he believed were the flaws in her arguments. But Karoline was no ordinary guest, and Paul was about to learn that the hard way. "Let's talk about the responsibility of media, Karoline," he began, his tone a blend of authority and faux concern. "Conservative outlets have built an empire on manufactured outrage, election fraud conspiracies, vaccine misinformation, the so-called war on free speech. Isn't it fair to say that networks like yours thrive not on truth, but on fear?" It was a setup, designed to force her onto the defensive, to make her stumble. The question was loaded, the kind of rhetorical grenade that had derailed countless guests before her. But Karoline didn't take the bait. Instead, she exhaled softly, almost as if she were disappointed by the predictability of his approach. "That's an interesting argument, Paul," she said, her voice calm and deliberate. "But if we're going to talk about fear-mongering, let's not pretend it's a one-sided issue." Her response was measured, her tone even, but there was a sharpness to her words that cut through the air like a knife. Paul's eyes flickered, just for a second, a silent acknowledgement that she wasn't rattled. He had expected her to bristle, to push back with emotion, but instead she met his challenge with a calm that was almost unnerving. Karoline folded her hands neatly in front of her, settling into her chair like someone who wasn't just prepared, but in control. "Let's be clear," she continued. "Misinformation is a problem. But let's ask the real question. Who gets to decide what qualifies as misinformation? Because if the past few years have shown us anything, it's that the so-called trusted media gets things wrong. A lot." Her words were deliberate, each one chosen with precision, and they landed with the weight of undeniable truth. Paul shifted, opening his mouth to counter, but Karoline didn't pause. She had already taken the reins, steering the conversation in a direction he hadn't anticipated. "Let's go down the list," she said, her voice smooth but unwavering. The Steele dossier, hailed as absolute truth, later debunked. The Covington Catholic students portrayed as aggressors before the full video exonerated them. The Hunter Biden laptop story, dismissed as Russian propaganda, only to be verified 2 years later. And those are just the headlines, Paul. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The examples she cited were not just isolated incidents. They were emblematic of a larger pattern, one that undermined the credibility of the very institutions that claimed to uphold the truth. Paul lifted a hand as if to interject, but Karoline wasn't finished. How many times have we seen mainstream outlets manipulate a story? How many times have key details been omitted? Narratives crafted to fit a political agenda? How often does correction come only after the damage is done? Her questions hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting, demanding an answer that Paul wasn't prepared to give. A beat of silence. Paul leaned back, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Karoline, those are isolated incidents. 3 examples in 10 seconds. His tone was dismissive, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, a subtle shift in his posture that betrayed his discomfort. She interrupted smoothly. "Want me to keep going?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and it sent a ripple through the studio. The air in the room changed. Even the crew could feel it. The controlled energy that had defined the early moments of the segment had started to erode, replaced by something sharper, more charged. Paul Danning leaned in, his voice measured but unmistakably firm. His words came not as an invitation to discussion, but as a challenge. "This is exactly the problem," he said, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. "People like you always playing the victim, always pretending conservatives are under siege when, in reality, it's your side that controls the conversation." Karoline didn't blink. "I see," she said, her voice controlled. "So when mainstream outlets label stories as misinformation and then quietly correct themselves years later, that's accountability. But when conservatives challenge the narrative, it's dangerous. That's quite the double standard, Paul." Her response was calm, but there was an edge to her words, a quiet intensity that made it clear she wasn't backing down. Paul scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, come on. Are we really going to pretend that conservatives don't thrive on this persecution complex? The so-called war on free speech? Give me a break. You don't want fairness? You want to say whatever you want without consequences." His tone was biting, his words laced with sarcasm, but Karoline didn't flinch. "And you don't, Paul," she shot back, her voice steady. The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to his credibility. His smile was tight. "The difference is," he said, "we actually deal in facts." The statement was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed it wholeheartedly, but Karoline wasn't buying it. She tilted her head slightly, a flicker of something passing through her eyes. "Facts," she repeated, "like the Steele dossier, the Covington Catholic students, the Hunter Biden laptop." Her tone was calm, but the examples she cited were damning, each one a reminder of the media's fallibility. Paul let out a dry chuckle, but there was an edge to it now. "Oh, please, the media got it wrong argument. You're reaching, Karoline. The difference between us is that when mistakes happen, we correct them. Meanwhile, your side doubles down on conspiracy theories, peddles fear, and pretends they're victims. You don't care about truth. You care about controlling the conversation." His words were sharp, his tone accusatory, but Karoline remained unfazed. The tension in the room had shifted. This wasn't just an argument. This was a battle. "Paul," Karoline said, her voice softer now, dangerously calm, "let me ask you something. Have you ever gotten it wrong?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Paul's lips pressed into a thin line. "We deal in facts," he repeated, his tone defensive. "Right?" She nodded, as if considering that. "So you stand by your record? By every word you've spoken on this show? Every claim?" Her questions were pointed, her gaze unwavering. Paul straightened. "Of course," he said, but there was a hesitation in his voice, a flicker of doubt that he couldn't quite hide. And that was it. That was the moment. Karoline reached beside her, her fingers resting on a neatly stacked pile of papers. "Interesting," she said. Paul's confidence didn't falter. Not yet. But the crew felt it. The producers, who had been passively observing, exchanged quick glances. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Paul held his posture, but something in his expression had shifted, a flicker of calculation, the gears turning as he weighed his next move. The cameras were still rolling, the internet was watching. He wasn't a man who backed down easily. His entire career had been built on steering conversations, controlling narratives, keeping the upper hand. But this time, something was different. Karoline didn't press him immediately. She let the weight of the moment settle, let the silence stretch just long enough for anticipation to coil around the room like a wire pulled tight. Then, with deliberate precision, she lifted the sheet of paper from her stack. "Paul," she said, her voice smooth, even, "I want to read something to you." She held the document up, just enough for the camera to catch the bolded headline. A direct quote from Paul Danning, from a private email leaked just hours before the broadcast. Verified and already making waves online. The words on the page weren't just a contradiction, they were damning. Paul's smile didn't falter, but it was thinner now, forced. His eyes flicked to the paper, then back to her. But he didn't lean forward this time. He stayed still, watching, waiting. Karoline didn't give him that luxury. "This email was sent from your account, dated 6 months ago," she said. "In it, you describe mainstream media's responsibility to control the messaging before the public forms the wrong conclusions." She glanced up, watching him closely. "Would you like to explain what you meant by that?" Paul inhaled sharply. "I'm not sure where you're getting this from, but I don't comment on internal communications." His tone was dismissive, but there was a note of defensiveness in his voice that hadn't been there before. "That's convenient," Karoline interjected, her voice calm but cutting. Paul exhaled through his nose. "Emails can be taken out of context. You know that. If you had any integrity, you'd acknowledge that pulling a single quote and spinning it is exactly what bad faith actors do to push a narrative." His words were sharp, his tone accusatory, but Karoline didn't blink. "Oh, I agree. Context matters," she said, reaching for another page. "Which is why I also have the rest of the thread. Would you like me to read it?" Paul's jaw tightened. From the control room, producers shifted, their expressions tense. They knew what was happening. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was exposure. It goes on to say, Karoline continued, flipping to the next page. We can't afford to let right-wing hysteria dictate the conversation, even if that means omitting inconvenient details until public sentiment is properly aligned. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Most people won't fact-check. They'll believe what we give them. That's why framing is everything. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Paul let out a slow breath, forced his shoulders back. This is ridiculous. You're cherry-picking phrases from private conversations, he began, but Karoline cut him off. Private conversations that prove exactly what you accuse my side of doing, she said, her voice steady. Manufacturing narratives. Controlling perception. Deciding what the public gets to believe. Paul let out a short, sharp laugh, but it was empty. Oh, come on, Karoline. If you think a few leaked emails prove some grand conspiracy, then you're no better than the people who cry about deep state shadow governments and stolen elections. You know what this is? This is desperate. His tone was biting, his words laced with sarcasm, but Karoline tilted her head slightly. Desperate? She repeated, her voice calm but loaded with meaning. Paul scoffed. You're reaching, and you know it. You can take a few out-of-context lines and spin them however you want, but anyone with half a brain can see what you're doing. This is just another bad-faith smear job. Is it? She said, her voice still calm. Then why is your network in full damage control right now? The question hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. Paul hesitated. A second was all it took. Because even as he tried to keep his composure, somewhere in the background, a producer was already pacing. Somewhere in the control room, an executive was already making a call. They weren't waiting for the fallout. It had already begun. And Paul Danning, for the first time in his career, wasn't holding the reins.